everyone, and welcome to our live stream about the life of Anne Boleyn and her incredible role in the Reformation of the Church of England. I am Marie Walker, and I am the director of the Ada May Ivester Education Center here at the Northeast Georgia History Center, and I am very interested in this topic. I think it's an incredibly fascinating topic, but it is also a topic that it gets a little bloody. There's some more graphic things in this presentation. We will not go into any depth, but they are referenced. So this might not be appropriate for all viewers. This is more of we usually have more of a G live stream. This might be more PG to PG-13. So if you would like to preview this before you show it to any of your younger children, that is probably a good idea. So now that we have had that disclaimer, we will begin our presentation about Anne Boleyn. So this is a very complicated subject with lots of different players. So before I go into the interworkings of the Tudor court, we're going to have a brief refresher about who's who in the Tudor court. So Anne Boleyn, that's who we're going to be starting off with today because she is the main central figure that we are going to be talking about. So Anne Boleyn, we believe she was born about 1501. We are not completely certain as to the date. We are also not completely certain where she ranks in the line of her siblings, but we assume that she is the second daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn and Lady Elizabeth Howard. Sir Thomas Boleyn was a merchant, a social climbing merchant. He was not born into the aristocracy himself. His family were merchants in this new, ever-expanding to a world economy. In the Tudor court, we start to see the beginnings of colonial empire in Britain, but it really has not started yet. Britain is really just coming out. Well, Britain isn't even Britain yet. Britain is just, that doesn't exist for another couple hundred years. So really, it's just England. The Scottish throne and the English throne have not been combined. Wales has been conquered by England at this point for a couple hundred years, as well as Ireland is still under the English throne. And they are always at war with their age-old enemy, France. It gets incredibly complicated, so I'm just going to leave it at that. So Sir Thomas Boleyn, merchant, social climber. That's what you need about him. Lady Elizabeth Howard. If you know anything about King Henry VIII and his 6 wives, you will also recognize the name Howard. Howard is a big political clan at this point. They're a large family that has a lot of political power. Sir Thomas Boleyn married Lady Elizabeth Howard. She married down, he married up. So Lady Elizabeth Howard provided Sir Thomas Boleyn with an in to the aristocracy and a way to climb even higher in the social rankings. So Anne Boleyn did spend time at the French court during her youth, the age-old enemy of England. But King Henry VIII's sister actually was married to the heir to the French throne at the time, so then became Queen of France, and Anne Boleyn was one of the English ladies in waiting who went to hang out with the French queen, who was actually English, because they were trying to make an alliance. It didn't exactly work. They still fought a whole bunch, but they were trying to do some diplomacy. But this is really important because Anne was really raised in the French court. She has been accused multiple times while in England of being too French. She actually introduced what she is wearing there and also what I am wearing. This is called the French hood, which is different than the English gable, which I will point out in the other portraits that we have. But the French hood, it's much different. It is more sleek. It is very nice and defined. She has a black, they mostly would have been black. This is my, I didn't know when I made this, but the veil in the back is almost always black. But I had white accents to this costume, so that's what I decided to do. That goes and then covers the hair. She was actually, most people would have worn the hair up at this time. She was known to have her hair down a lot, which is just kind of, I think it plays to her her nature of not wanting to necessarily conform to some societal conventions of being very fiercely independent, is how I see Anne Boleyn. A lot of people have a lot of different views, but I see her as a very fiercely independent woman with her own political views and her own ideas of how things should be done. But what's really important about her in the French court as well is that she was on the continent of Europe at the beginning of the Reformation, of when Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door, and France was becoming, it was more open to these Protestant ideas that Anne was then exposed to. She was known to have some reform pamphlets in her possession, and she seemed to be sympathetic to the Reformation. She then returned to England in 1522 and rejoined King Henry VIII's court at that time. So, King Henry VIII, we do know exactly when he was born. He was born on the 28th of June in 1491, and he is the son of King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth of York. So he was the first, King Henry VII, that is. He was the first monarch of the House of Tudor, and Henry's mother was a descendant of the Lancastrian branch of the House of Plantagenet. So the Tudor rose is actually made up of a red rose and a white rose, representing the two houses in the War of the Roses. Which was basically lots of little wars that kind of created an English civil war as people were fighting over the throne. Henry's dad won. He was the first Tudor monarch. Henry VIII is really just the second Tudor monarch in this dynasty that he is trying to create, as they have just captured the English throne. They have then combined those two roses from the War of the Roses into the Tudor rose to even farther establish that they are the true monarch of England. So the House of Lancaster is represented by a red rose, and the House of York is represented by a white rose, and this is seen as a unifying symbol after the War of the Roses, which was, again, a series of English civil wars fought over control of the throne that Henry VII won. That's very, in a nutshell, that is the English Civil War. I'm just trying to mention this so you understand that there's a lot happening at the Tudor court that Anne is just kind of stepping into, and England is really going through. There was a whole lot of uncertainty. There's now unity, and they're going to try to keep it that way to show that they are in charge and in power. Also, Henry VIII was never supposed to be king. He only became heir apparent when his brother, Arthur, died at the age of 15. And his reign began on the 22nd of April, 1509, when his father passed away. So he knew he was going to become king because his brother died before his father did. So Arthur never actually became king. He was just heir apparent for a very long time. And then Henry was like, oh, I guess that's me now. So Catherine of Aragon, another huge player in the English Reformation and the Tudor court. So she's the Spanish princess. She's the daughter of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. And she was actually married to Arthur, Prince of Wales, in 1501. That is Henry VIII's brother, who was supposed to be king. So Catherine of Aragon was always supposed to be Queen of England. Henry VIII was not. But 5 months after she married Arthur to become the Queen of England, the future Queen of England, she becomes a widow. He dies. He becomes sick just a couple weeks after their wedding. And then they think that he died of sweating sickness, which is something that we do not necessarily have to this day and are not necessarily sure how to define in our modern medical terms. But that is what he is reported to have died of. So after Arthur dies, what is Isabella I of Castile to do? No one really seems to know for about 9 years. So she hangs out at the Tudor court because they don't want to send her back because they're trying to make an alliance with Spain, who is a very powerful country. They also don't want to return her dowry, which is a lot of money. And also, Henry VIII kind of likes her. He thinks that she's really smart and funny and can keep up with him at an intellectual level. He thinks that she's, nice to look at. And they really start to kind of basically fall in love over this 9-year period. but they aren't necessarily sure really what to do because, well, she was married to his brother and there's a bunch of complicating factors. But eventually, right after Henry becomes king, because she's in limbo for this long time, where she is actually the ambassador of the Aragonese crown to England, one of the first female ambassadors to ever happen, basically because she's stuck at the Tudor court, so she becomes the ambassador for her people. She ends up marrying King Henry VIII in 1509, right after his father dies, because his father didn't really want to make a decision on this, but Henry VIII really liked Catherine. Dare I say, did love Catherine. And once he became king, he had the power to say, I'm going to marry her in 1509. All right, another big player in this whole Reformation process is Martin Luther. He was ordained to the priesthood, that is the Catholic priesthood, in 1507. But about 10 years after that, Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, which were 95 points as to why he thinks the Catholic Church is corrupt and wrong, especially under the idea of indulgences, which was basically paying your way out of sin, which is not necessarily mentioned in the Bible. And Luther really wanted to get back to the biblical roots that he believed that the Catholic Church had gotten away from. He didn't want to create a whole new sect of Christianity, but that's kind of what happened. He really just wanted to reform the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church said no. So then you have the European Wars of Religion, which basically began in 1517 when the 95 Theses are posted, and then they last until the early 18th century. So they go on for quite some time, especially on the continent of Europe. So the continent of Europe is a little bit of a mess, and this is really a grassroots movement. That's an interesting thing. It's one priest who has this idea about how to reform the church, and other people agree. But the leaders say, no, we don't like that. Another thing to keep in mind as we go through the English Reformation, which is completely different. All right, so Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, they have a happy early marriage. So early in their marriage, they're very happy together. They are a great couple, really. They're a power couple. They're both smart. They're both very interested in politics. Catherine is incredibly shrewd and knows how things work. She is an incredible regent when Henry is off fighting, basically leads a battle against the Scottish crown. The only problem that created a lot of tension in their marriage is that she gave birth to 6 children and only one of them survived, and that is Mary Tudor, who later becomes Queen Mary, Bloody Mary. And Henry VIII, he really wanted a male heir. He wanted a male heir to establish the Tudor dynasty. Remember, he's only the second Tudor monarch, and he, at this time where sexism runs rampant, he does not believe that his daughter Mary can handle the English crown on her own. Catherine does give birth to several male children, but they all are either stillborn or die a few weeks after they are given birth to. This is common in a time where children barely survived their first birthday. There's a very, very high infant mortality rate. But Henry, he starts to think, well, maybe something's wrong with their marriage, and that is why. She's also getting older. She was older than him when they got married. I guess no one really thought that of a problem until she got too old to have children. And that's when he began to get worried about having a male heir. So Henry VIII was beginning to wonder, perhaps my marriage is cursed, and that is why I cannot have a son. And he thought maybe it was something wrong with him, their marriage. But then you have Elizabeth Blunt, and she is one of the mistresses to Henry VIII, and he had an illegitimate son with this woman, whose name is Henry Fitzroy, who became the Duke of Richmond, and he was born in 1519. So Henry has had a lot of mistresses, but at this time period, he's really beginning to stray from his wife, and also he has a son that survives. So he begins to think it's not something that's wrong with me, it's something that's wrong with Catherine and our marriage. Henry, he very much claims this son as him, as it is given his own name, and also Fitzroy, which means son of the king. A lot of illegitimate children of monarchs are given that last name of Fitzroy, which literally means son of the king, but they will not be given the name Tudor because they are not legitimate. But Henry very much recognizes Henry and makes him Duke of Richmond. So the king began to blame the queen for not producing a healthy and legitimate male heir, as obviously Henry can. So we have another mistress of Henry VIII, which further proves Henry points that he can have a male son, just Catherine can't. But also, it's a Boleyn. Marie Boleyn, who is the mistress to Henry VIII, she is believed to be the younger sister of Anne Boleyn, and she was married to William Carey in 1520. And she may have had 2 of the king's children. Henry does not recognize these children as much as he recognizes his own son Henry Fitzroy. But if you look at portraits of the son especially, he looks very much like the king and not so much what we believe William Carey to look like. The daughter does not resemble King Henry VIII as much and may have actually been the daughter of William Carey. We do not know. But it is said that Mary introduced Henry to her sister, Anne. There's also a whole fictional story called The Other Boleyn Girl that really follows Mary's journey that we don't know much about, so a lot of it is historical fiction sprinkled in with historical fact. But I think it's an incredibly interesting read, and also Anne, having a sister who was already mistress to Henry VIII, she saw how Mary was used, she saw how Henry discarded Mary when he was basically bored of her, and also Mary had a husband to hide behind who could not really say no to her being the mistress of King Henry VIII because King Henry's, well, the king. But if Mary were to have children, she wasn't not going to be ostracized because she was already married. So that brings us back to Anne. What has Anne been doing once she has gotten back to the court of Henry VIII? Well, she actually served as a maid of honor to Catherine of Aragon. It's a little awkward. But as Henry is pursuing her and is very much infatuated with her, she is a maid to his wife. And she refuses to become the king's mistress. Some people have varying ideas as to why she did this. She does not have a husband to hide behind. If she were to get pregnant, that would make her very much ostracized. Perhaps it's because she is a woman of deep faith and does not believe that she should become a mistress to the king, who already has a wife. It might be because she wants more power and doesn't want to just be used and then discarded by the king. There are also letters where she says, if I am to be your mistress, I want to be your only mistress. Because the king's mistress does have a lot of power at court. She just doesn't want to be one of many. She wants a special position. So halfway through 1526, Henry begins to decide that he wants to marry Anne Boleyn. He has been trying to get rid of Catherine for a while at this point, but seeing Anne kind of leading this, I don't want to have relations with you if I am not going to be someone special to you. If I'm not going to have power that comes with this, I don't want to do that. And also, Anne's much younger than Catherine, and Henry believes that she can have a son that he so badly wants. So, thus begins the great matter, and that is what Henry trying to divorce or get an annulment for his marriage with Catherine of Aragon is called at court. It is called the great matter. This is the king's great matter that he is very much entrenched in during this time period. So Henry had decided to end his marriage to Catherine in 1527. He's decided he wants to marry Anne, he wants to get rid of Catherine, but the Catholic Church does not allow divorce. So Henry needs an annulment. So annulments are granted when a court makes a finding that a marriage is invalid, that it was never valid in the first place, while a divorce ends a legally valid marriage. An annulment treats the marriage as if it never existed in the first place, that it was like a mistake, that someone lied at the beginning of it and it should never have happened. So he wants to get an annulment that basically makes it like his marriage to Catherine never happened. To do this, Henry cites a passage in Leviticus, which is one of the first books of the Bible in the Old Testament, as grounds for an annulment, which says that if a man marries his brother's wife, it is an act of impurity. He has dishonored his brother and they will be childless, which is Leviticus 20:21. And Henry claimed that the Pope, who granted the marriage, had been wrong to do so in the first place. Now, you want the Pope to admit that he is wrong? That's not going to go over well, because the Pope had basically to marry Henry, for Henry to marry Catherine, he had to go through the Pope to get it approved by the Pope. And the Pope said, yes, you can do that. Have a happy marriage. And they did for a little bit, and then they didn't. So, you can see how this is not going to go well for either of them. Because Catherine does not agree with Henry. Catherine thinks that she should still be Queen of England, so she did not share her husband's views on the matters of the annulment. So she appealed to Pope Clement VII and basically said that her marriage to Henry was valid because the previous marriage to Arthur, which really only lasted 5 months, most of which he was sick for, except for like a week, she said that their marriage had never been consummated. So, when Catherine married Arthur, he was young, he was sickly, and then he died about a year later. So, it is rather unlikely that the marriage was actually ever consummated, and that Catherine was a virgin when she married King Henry VIII. And she never wavered from her claims. And she is a woman of deep faith, of deep conviction. She is very Catholic, and is a woman of very, very deep faith, and has been, and even after, because she had 5 children that died. And this takes a toll on her physically and emotionally, and as she gets older and older, she turns to her faith more and more for comfort. And I personally think that it would be very unlikely for her to lie about something of this matter, and it's something that she never wavers from at all. So I think it's very, I think she's telling the truth in this matter, that it was, she believed that she was, without a doubt, Henry VIII's wife, and should be Henry VIII's wife, and should be Queen of England. So Pope Clement VII is in Rome, and he is surrounded at this moment in time by the Holy Roman Emperor, who also happens to be Catherine's nephew. Which makes this also even more interesting. So you have Henry, who says, I think that the Pope before you was wrong, and that this is not a real marriage, and I went out. And then you have Catherine, who says, my husband's lying, that's not what happened, you see. I was a virgin when we got married. I never did anything with his brother, and so we're fine. And then you also have the Pope who is surrounded by the troops of Catherine's nephew. So you really don't want to make Catherine angry, do you? Because Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, literally has the Vatican surrounded by his troops. So Pope Clement VII was caught in a very hard predicament between leaders of two very powerful nations. So the Pope did not want to lose England. England's a Catholic country, and the continent of Europe is being swept over by Protestant Reformation. He is losing Catholic countries left and right as they become more Protestant and adopt this idea of Protestantism. And that means that he's losing power, he's losing money, he's losing people to this faith that he doesn't think is correct. He really, really wants to hold on to England. But he also does not want to get attacked by the Holy Roman Emperor. And, I mean, if you're looking at this from a legitimate process, Henry VIII's making the whole thing up and his wife is right. But that doesn't play into this as much as it should have. So, the Pope basically, he doesn't give an answer for a very long time. He's like, we're looking into it. We're looking into it. We're looking into it. Henry VIII sends an ambassador. We're looking into the matter. It's a great matter. We're looking into it. And that goes on for a very long time, where basically he doesn't give an answer one way or the other. And he just says, we're looking into it. Which makes people very annoyed. It does keep the threat of attack from Charles V's troops at bay, because they're like, oh, well, he's looking into it. That means that they're still married. That's what we want. But it does get Henry VIII very, very angry, because they're not doing anything about this great matter of his. So eventually Pope Clement VII, basically he's refusing to annul the marriage. And he cites another verse that says that if brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her for his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And that is Deuteronomy 25:5. Which, if you look at it, the other one said wife, not widow. Of course, we are trying to translate ancient Hebrew into, at this point, it would be Middle English. So some things get lost in translation, but at that point, it's like, well, the other one doesn't say anything about a widow. This one actually does, and this is exactly your situation, buddy. You know, you were still living with your brother. He died. He had no son. So, I mean, it makes sense. This is what God wanted. Well, Henry VIII was like, I still don't want to do that, because I want to marry Anne, because I want to have a son. So Henry VIII separates from Catherine in July of 1531 on his own accord. And then he secretly marries Anne in the January of 1533. And Henry and Thomas Cranmer, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, were excommunicated because of this. So Henry really never broke with the Church of Rome. His actions caused Rome to break with Henry. So Henry never really wanted to make his own church, per se. But he wanted to do his own things his own way. And because of this, because of his actions, they were excommunicated. So to be excommunicated, that means that the Catholic Church basically says, get out, and we don't want you here anymore. It's even a bigger deal, because basically it's the same thing as, especially in this time period, damnation, which means because you cannot come into the church, you cannot do confession, you cannot perform any of the sacraments, you cannot take communion, and you don't get last rites, which basically means you're going to hell in the Catholic Church at this time. So Henry is ready to risk his soul for this, because he is himself very Catholic. He had been raised Catholic. He had been awarded the honor of Defender of the Faith from the Pope, which is a big deal And now he's being excommunicated from the very church he had protected because of his marriage to Anne Boleyn. So it's a big deal that, first of all, Anne Boleyn basically said, I don't want to be your mistress. If I'm going to be your mistress, I better be your only mistress. Might as well just make me your queen, and then we can have sons. So she was a very, very strong, opinionated woman who knew exactly what she wanted. Her family didn't really think that this was a great idea for her to marry the king. She was not popular because she caused a rift in the church. And also, they had kind of seen what happened with Mary, and they know that King Henry VIII can lose interest pretty fast. And also, you just banished the queen from court, who had been very popular. Catherine had been a very, very popular queen. And now she's banished from court. And this devastated Catherine, and she was sent into exile. And until her dying breath, she called herself the rightful Queen of England and refused to acknowledge Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn basically had a party when she died, which did not make her look good, especially when you have a whole nation that was raised Catholic, and a lot of them are still very, very devoted to the faith, which they saw Catherine as still being basically their last person in charge who was still Catholic that they could turn to, that was like their figurehead, their spokeswoman, that was representing their interests. And the king was not going to listen to her. He cast her aside, and that upset a very large portion of the country. But Catherine, she, till her dying breath, called herself the rightful Queen of England, and she also never wavered in her account that she and Arthur had never been together sexually, and that her marriage to King Henry VIII was still valid. And basically, he has a mistress that he's calling a queen in Anne Boleyn. Catherine did not like Anne Boleyn at all. So Catherine of Aragon had always been very, very much loved by the people, but Henry VIII forced her to spend her last years isolated from all public life, and from her daughter. So now we have Queen Anne. And wow. So on June 1st, 1533, Anne Boleyn, who had been very much of a social climbing family, we know that she had been trying to make advantageous matches for herself even before King Henry VIII. She had tried to marry the Duke of basically the largest land-owning Duke in England, and then basically she was told she was not good enough for their son. And Thomas Cranmer, who she has a lasting battle with over power, basically told her that she was not good enough to be the to marry basically one of the highest ranking dukes or earls. But now she's Queen of England, and she's good enough to be Queen of England. And Henry VIII was determined that all people, domestic and abroad, would accept that Anne was to be honored as his wife and his queen. And her crowning must therefore incorporate every traditional element of a big, grand, medieval coronation. And the events surrounding her coronation lasted for 4 days. It began with a fleet of barges rowing from Greenwich, which is the palace that they were at, to accompany the Queen in her barge to the Tower of London. And as she approached, over 1,000 rounds were fired from the great guns of the Tower of London, which is so many. And then continuing with tradition, on the 3rd day, Anne was paraded through the city of London. She was dressed in all white and ermine mantle. Her dark hair was flowing loose as she was carried through the streets on a litter, and she was surrounded by hundreds of courtiers, ladies and officials in scarlet and velvet robes, and she looked every inch the queen that she had dreamed of being. She has made it to the highest rank that a woman can in the Tudor court, and she, by all accounts, was enjoying it. So early on Sunday, Anne left Westminster Hall clad in purple velvet and ermine, and she walked under a canopy borne by the Lord Warden of the Westminster Abbey, and there she prostrated herself before the high altar, and then received the crown of St. Edward and the rod and scepter of the Archbishop of Canterbury. A Te Deum was sung, and Anne returned to preside over the extravagant coronation feast at Westminster Hall. But beside all of this grand display of her power, of her looking like every inch of queen, of being paraded through the streets, she was not popular. The people were like, she's not our queen. Catherine's still our queen, and we don't like this lady because she kind of just seems like she's the mistress of the king. And now we all kind of got excommunicated because the king decided that he wanted to marry his mistress. And now, like, everyone's soul's in jeopardy, and this is bad. So basically, no one liked her except King Henry VIII. But she didn't seem to have that much of a problem with that. She had her own faction that really supported her, who wanted reform, who wanted to be a Protestant nation, who didn't like the Catholic Church. There were a lot of those people in England as well, and they liked her. So she was already pregnant at her coronation, and on September 7th, 1533, Princess Elizabeth is born, and she is a bitter disappointment, as Queen Anne had, we assume, it's not necessarily written anywhere, but it was basically, if not said by her, said by other people, that she had basically promised Henry a son. That if he were to make her queen, that they would have sons, but they had to, you know, be married for them to be legitimate heirs that then could take the crown. And the first child that is born is a girl, and this made her mother's position at court and in the Reformation very precarious. So, but nonetheless, they were very happy, and that with this healthy girl child, it was like basically, oh well, this is a good practice round. We can do it. We can have a kid. The kid's great. You know, they didn't hate Elizabeth because she was a girl. It was just a little bit of a letdown after the whole breaking with the Church of Rome, possible damnation for a son, and then it's not a son. So they were just kind of disappointed that it was a girl, but they still loved Elizabeth. They didn't, you know, just hate her. But they were disappointed, and it was harder because Henry did it was like, oh well, you said we kind of assumed we had talked about having a son, and it's not. So it didn't. If Anne had had a son, it would have secured her position, and her position now is not secured. But nevertheless, they still wanted to make sure that all of the children of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were, without a doubt, the heirs to the English throne. So you have the Act of Succession, which was on the 23rd of March, 1534. And this vested the succession of the English crown in the children of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And it made Princess Elizabeth first in line to the throne, and also it delegitimized Mary, because they basically said the marriage between Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII never should have happened. It's annulled because we have our own church now, and it's gone. Married's not legitimate, and this girl, who is in her teens at this point, who had been told she was going to be Queen of England and had been preparing to be Queen of England, is now illegitimate and has no right to the throne, which makes her upset. At this point, yes, she's just does not sit well. And then she's supposed to go and be a lady to Princess Elizabeth, basically like a maid, like a fancy maid to her stepsister who has taken her place. We also have in 1534 the Act of Supremacy, and this is passed in Parliament as the Act of Supremacy, and it rejected all papal jurisdiction in England. So this is the heart of the Reformation right here, of the English Reformation. Henry had already been excommunicated from the Catholic Church. They thought, well, maybe we'll just smooth everything over and it'll be fine. Like, I'll just do what I want and they'll just be like, oh, Henry, okay, well, you rascal, it's fine, we'll just deal with it. But no, the Catholic Church said, you did this, it is wrong, we are excommunicating you. And Henry said, well, fine then, if I can't be part of your club, I'll make my own. And this is when all papal jurisdiction in England is rejected, and Henry VIII becomes the head of the Church of England. And this really supports the divine right of kings to a new extent, because Thomas Cromwell, who built a very convincing case that England should not be subject to the Pope's jurisdiction, because this and this made perfect sense to a king who believed that the divine right to rule asserted that kings derived the authority from God alone, that they could, and therefore they could not be held accountable for their actions by any earthly authority, such as Parliament, and in this case, the Pope. So here, King Henry VIII took this doctrine of divine right one step further and decided that the Pope was just another form of earthly authority. Of course, in the Catholic Church, that is not how that works. And that, therefore, he should not have to answer as a king to the Pope. Of course, the Catholic Church did not see it that way, because in the Catholic Church, the Pope is God's spokesperson on earth, and kings are still supposed to submit to the Pope. This does not help the papal relations with King Henry VIII at all. It further drives a wedge between ever reconciling that. This act also required an oath of loyalty. So the Act of Supremacy required an oath of loyalty from all English subjects to recognize King Henry VIII as the as the head of the Church of England, and the legitimacy of his marriage to Anne Boleyn. This is where people got really upset, and some people lost their heads, because at this point, what do? You are an English citizen, but you are also Catholic. Do you basically deny your faith and your loyalty to the Pope because of your loyalty to the king? It used to be simple because everyone went together. But now, which one do you choose? And you have to take an oath of loyalty. Literally, like, everyone has to take an oath of loyalty to King Henry VIII as head of the Church of England, as the defender of the faith, and also recognize the marriage of Anne Boleyn, who a lot of people thought was illegitimate. So this it caused a lot of problems. But also, you can very much see that Anne Boleyn wants to be recognized as queen, as the only queen, that she is queen and no one else is, and Catherine of Aragon has gone off and it doesn't matter anymore, it was never real. That's Anne's camp, and she basically has asserted herself as the true Queen of England. She very much enjoys this role and uses the power accordingly. A lot of times people might see that as perhaps selfish, but she also seems to use her power for good things as well. And also, she very much was sympathetic to Reformation. It's very much not necessarily documented, because a lot of things we have been lost in the past 500 years or so, but Anne Boleyn, who we do know to be sympathetic to the Protestant cause, could have very much influenced and shaped the ideas of the Church of England, the delegitimacy of the Pope, and to have more Protestant influence in England. So because of the passage of the Act of Supremacy in the 1534, this solidified the break from the Catholic Church, and it made the king the supreme head of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. So Henry basically uses the title that the Pope had given him, Defender of the Faith, as he used to be the defender of the Catholic faith, and decided that that's going to be his new title in the Anglican Church as well. You also have the Tyndale Bible, which is being published at this time in 1534 as the first Bible that is in the English language. A large part of the Reformation movement was that to get Bibles into the hands of people in their own vernacular language so that they can read the Bible for themselves. Mass had traditionally just been in Latin, which a lot of people did not understand. And also, you had the Bible in the church, and it was in Latin, and only the priest could read it because it's in Latin. And a lot of people couldn't even read. If they could read, it was not Latin. So a big part of this movement is to get the Bible translated from Latin or Greek or Hebrew, its original languages, to the vernacular language of people so that they could read and have spiritual experiences for themselves, which it seems like Anne supported as well, but was not ready to get too far out there in her advocation. But it seemed like she was not actively fighting against it and seemed to be sympathetic towards the cause, but it's not something she greatly championed. And basically, the rest of Henry VIII's reign was involved in trying to compile the doctrine of this church, which kind of ended up being the Catholic Church Part 2, but just without the Pope. So now we have Anne's decline. So Anne had a miscarriage in 1534, and in 1536 she gave birth to a stillborn son. And Henry VIII begins to think, I am cursed yet again. You have a large section of the country who hates Anne and thinks that basically, again, that the King of England caused jeopardy to their religious faith and married his mistress and really don't like her. And Rome was even willing to forget that Henry's former actions, basically marrying Anne and creating his own church, if he just got rid of Anne. So, on May 2nd, 1534, Henry had Anne committed to the Tower of London. So Anne has always had a power struggle with Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell was this man who said that she was not good enough to marry this man that we believe that she had loved, because they were two young people who neither of their families wanted them to marry, but they wanted to marry, which very much is what one would consider to be, they loved each other, they wanted to get married, and then their families pulled them apart. And she blamed Thomas Cromwell for doing this, for telling her that she was not good enough, which really lit a fire in her because she is from this social climbing family. She wants to be seen as good enough. She wants to be seen as respectable. They also clashed on matters of foreign policy. Anne was very much a politically minded person. She was incredibly smart. She was incredibly ambitious and had a large part of governing. She was not just wanting to be in power just to be in power. She had things she wanted to do to make England better. But Thomas Cromwell and her, they clashed on matters of foreign policy, and they also clashed on matters of the king's finances. Boleyn was actually possibly involved in passing a nationwide legislation titled the Poor Law, which would have helped the nation's poor. It was big social reform. And this Poor Law also stated that local officials should find work for the unemployed. And the law created a new governing council that rivaled the one headed by Cromwell. Oh, that means Cromwell's going to have to share power. Cromwell doesn't like that. So Anne wanted to basically set up this national council to rival the king's Privy Council, which Cromwell was head of. That did not set well with Cromwell. We do not have incredibly great documentation for that, but that's a new theory that is emerging about why Cromwell also wanted the queen gone. But it's been very well known for a very long time that Cromwell and the Queen Anne, clashed on a lot of different matters. There was that old hurt there from basically keeping her from marrying the man that she loved. She ended up marrying Henry VIII. It is unclear as to like if they actually like loved each other. It looks more like Henry had a great fascination with Anne, and Anne saw this as, you aren't that bad. You're the king. This could be a good match for me. It's a good political move. And, you know, that seems nice. So, all the charges on the next slide were exaggerated or wholly fabricated by this man here. So, at Anne's trial, we have Thomas Cromwell, who accused Anne of witchcraft, adultery, incest, high treason, and this is where it gets really, really icky. She was tried by her uncle and her former fiance, so that man that we truly believe that she did love, her own uncle. Her father was even in on this. We assume that he tried to warn her of it. But at this point, what do you do? What do you do when someone has accused you of all of these things? They have already tried the men. By the time that Anne gets to trial, they've already tried all the men, including her brother, which is the incest, who are basically said to have had relations with her. And they are also all found guilty. Her brother dies and is already sentenced to death by the time she is going to trial. There is no possible way that, because they already found all the men guilty, they're going to find her guilty too. Some of them confessed under torture, because these are all wholly exaggerated and or false. This is a way that Henry VIII wants to get rid of Anne. She didn't give him a son. He blames her for causing the break with him in the Church of England, which she did not. She herself was perhaps one of the most, not necessarily by means of political radicalism, but because she was who she was and she wanted what she wanted and had sympathy towards the Protestant ideas and was not incredibly dedicated to the church in Rome, even though she was a woman of faith, just not necessarily dedicated to the idea of Catholicism, that she helped facilitate all of this. So they find her guilty and she is sentenced to death. Even before her trial, King Henry VIII has already asked for the swordsmen to come. The trial was a whole sham, basically to get the queen beheaded. So King Henry VIII, he does not want to have just a divorce from this woman. He believes that she has done wrong, even though she has done nothing but be a strong, powerful woman who was not afraid to voice her opinions. But because of this, she is beheaded on the 19th of May, 1536, and she is beheaded by a French swordsman. Some people say, oh, it's this last act of love that Henry had. He gave her a sword instead of the axe. How nice. He still killed her. She's still being killed. More likely, she still represents the crown. See the crown on her head? She still represents the crown of England that goes on his head too. And you want a more dignified death for someone that is so highly associated with you. And therefore, a sword is a more dignified end than the axe. So that is, it's not an act of love that you behead them in a nicer way. It's more humane. It was. But also it looked better for the public to see. It's nice one clean swoop of the queen's head instead of the axe, which got very messy and took a couple swings and it wasn't not good. This execution, it took place at the Tower of London. People are not necessarily certain exactly where at the Tower of London this execution took place. More or less, people have agreed in the sign at the Tower of London is on the Tower of Green, right outside the central tower, but not outside the wall. And it is believed that her last words were, "To Jesus Christ, I condemn my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." And this is an interesting, here, where is it? Oh, it is usually, depending on what text you're looking at, sometimes it's spelled G, instead of Jesus the second time, it's spelled G-E-S-U, which is how you would pronounce, it's the phonetic spelling of the French word for Jesus, which again, it's her French coming out one last time. She was always considered to be too French for the English court, too French to be the English queen, even though she's English. But she very much liked the French dress, the French manners, even French political and religious ideas. And therefore, she dies, but England does remain a Protestant country. And that is when, right after her death, Henry goes to Jane Seymour. So Henry had actually been having an adulterous relationship with two of the Queen's maid of honor, that is Meg Shelton and Jane Seymour. He very much has been infatuated with Jane Seymour. Anne had been fiery and opinionated and would fight with King Henry on matters of politics and religion, and very much had opinions about how things should be done and how things she wanted to be done. Versus Jane Seymour, who comes from a very noble family. She's rather plain, and she doesn't have many opinions. She's just Jane. Plain Jane. And Henry marries Jane Seymour on the 30th of May, 1536, about 15 days after he has his second wife killed. So Anne, going back to Anne, she was a private gentlewoman from a middle-ranking family, and she displaced a Spanish princess, one of the most powerful nations at the time. She, by her own determination and stubbornness, overturned 1,000 years of English obedience to the Church of Rome, of course, with King Henry VIII and also the Archbishop of Canterbury. And this was her moment of glory, of being crowned queen. And the accumulation of more than 7 years of ambition, frustration, and legal wrangling, Anne would now go down in history as having a role as the catalyst, as one of the main reasons of the Protestant Reformation in England, which was different than all other Reformations. All other Reformations had been a grassroots going up to the hierarchy saying, hey, people in charge, we have this new idea, let's do this new thing. In England, it was a top-down Reformation, which is very different than literally everywhere else in the world at this time, where the king breaks with the Church of Rome. The Church of Rome breaks with the king. And therefore, it goes down through the Catholic Church that it's Protestant now, that they don't listen to the Pope, and they listen to the King of England. Very fascinating subject. To this day, Queen Elizabeth II, who is descended, not necessarily from Henry VIII, but is descended from Anne Boleyn because of her sister and her sister's child. Which is just all very fascinating, is still the head of the Church of England and the defender of the faith, and has that role and has that title bestowed upon them at their coronation. So if you found this presentation to be interesting and you would like to continue learning, we have some resources for you to do that, and that is The Rise and the Fall of Anne Boleyn by Retha M. Warwick, which was used as source material for this presentation, as well as The Rise and Fall of, The Role and Influence of Anne Boleyn by Cynthia L. Abrams.
All right. Thank you so much, Marie.
Absolutely.
I feel like I went through a whole Tudor soap opera.
It really is. The Tudors are very dramatic.
Sue says, this was fantastic. I love this time period. Thank you all so much. Oh, yeah, that was fascinating. Let's see. We did have one question about, the word Tudor, is that a family name or a place name? What does Tudor actually mean?
Yes. So Tudor, T-U-D-O-R, sometimes U-R, depending on at this time period,
Yeah.
things didn't have they didn't have a dictionary and things were spelled phonetically. But that is the family name of Henry VIII. So then that becomes the name for the dynasty. So right now we have the House of Windsor, or Windsor Mountbatten, and that is the last name of Queen Elizabeth is Windsor, and therefore you have the whole family of Windsor, and that is their title. So that is the name of King Henry VII and his dynasty, which only lasted, well, depending on how you look at it, some of them, there were 5 Tudor monarchs, but really the important ones were Henry VII, Henry VIII, and then Queen Elizabeth, who was Queen Anne's daughter. And some people call Anne's revenge or shining star that King Henry VIII wanted a son so bad, but his son really didn't do anything. He was so young and died so young. And then you have Queen Elizabeth, who brought England into its golden age, and she had the smarts and the ambition of her mother. But it was also kind of sad because people still hated her mom, so she really couldn't talk about her mother at court or with anyone.
Yeah, that clears it up, and it seems like Queen Elizabeth would be an excellent topic.
She's so interesting.
So I'm sure we'll cover that sometime.
Anne's legacy,
yeah,
which is so amazing because Anne was beheaded when Elizabeth was so young, and she has from what we can tell, is very few memories of her mother, but it had a very large impact upon her life, and why she chose not to marry. Why she wanted to remain unmarried, because she saw her father and how he treated women and how that was awful, and did not want to do that. Of course, along with other reasons about not wanting to give up power and things of that nature. But no, it's an incredibly fascinating topic. As you can tell, I could go on a very long time about this.
And we have lots of compliments about your dress as well.
Yeah,
and
I made it.
Amy says, I've been watching The Tudors on Netflix, and it was interesting to hear the fully non-fiction version of Anne. Thank you. Do you know where she was buried, and can the public visit her gravesite?
Yes. So it is harder to figure out exactly where she's buried, because she's buried basically in a mass grave that is inside the church. I never got over how in England, apparently, you bury people inside churches. That's not something that we really do in America. But that's what they did in England. So there is the chapel at the Tower of London. At the top there is basically a mass grave where they buried all of the people beheaded there. And Anne is supposedly in there, and you can go visit it, yes.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Marie, for this
Absolutely.
fascinating presentation. We can't wait to see you at our next presentations.
Yes.
We'll have, of course, our live stream next Wednesday and our next members live stream next Friday. So we can't wait to see you there. Check out our events on Facebook for all of our fascinating topics coming up. And we so appreciate you being a member of the Northeast Georgia History Center.
Absolutely. Until next time.